You're listening to The Ones Who Succeed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Hi there, I'm Campbell Barron, or at Campbell J. Barron on Instagram and Twitter. Welcome to the program. And today on the program, I'm thrilled to have a conversation with Blake Robbins. He is a VC at Ludlow Ventures, which is an early-stage venture firm with previous investments in companies like Honey, AngelList, and Product Hunt, to name a few. And before VC life, Blake spent time at Google, Nest, and SpaceX. But perhaps more importantly, at least to me, Blake is really in tune to not only the world of startups, but the world of content creators and influencers. And his views and ideas on these topics, which he often shares on Twitter, makes him a really interesting guest to have on the podcast. And as a result, Blake, based in Detroit, Michigan, joined this program via Zoom to discuss his origin story, all things venture capital, startups, creators, and of course, where he sees the industry heading in the coming years. This is The Ones Who Succeed. I'm Campbell Barron. My conversation with Blake Robbins starts now. Well, Blake, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the program.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to do this.
So I follow you on Twitter, and I think as a result, I almost, and don't take this the wrong way, but I almost feel like I know you a little bit. I think it's really interesting how you use Twitter, and you've built quite a decent personal brand, but I also think your perspectives on all things kind of startups and creators and the intersection between those two industries are really interesting, and so I really want to talk to you about that. But before we get into kind of all of that, if you can kind of give me the quick rundown, introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
For sure. Yeah. So my name's Blake. I hopefully my Twitter is representative of who I am as a human, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, we'll see. But yeah, so born and raised in the suburbs of Detroit, and always thought I'd end up in the automotive world just because that's what my family did. And I knew nothing different than that. And so I knew I didn't want to be a doctor and a lawyer. And when you're in the suburbs of Detroit, you sort of just assume if you're going to do business, you'll end up in automotive. Very quickly realized once I got to college, I went to Michigan State, that it wasn't really what I wanted to do. But I actually studied supply chain management, which is like operations and manufacturing and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And then from that, ended up discovering startups my freshman year because I went to a career fair at Michigan State, and I realized.
And what year would this be?
This is 2011, actually.
Okay.
And so I went to a career fair in 2011, realized very quickly that all of these Fortune 500 companies were not taking a freshman intern, and it got me really upset. I was just like, what is going on? I'm young and ambitious, and there has to be someone that will appreciate me. And so my thought just initially went towards startups because I had read about startups on TechCrunch and whatnot. I forget how I discovered TechCrunch, but immediately went to TechCrunch and started cold emailing companies on the front page. One of those companies was a company called Zarly, which was like a reverse eBay or reverse Craigslist. And thankfully they were willing to let me do campus marketing for them. And so I did campus marketing. From there, ended up being a top campus marketer. And that led to me being the prize for being a top campus marketer was that you got to go to a board meeting. And that's where I basically discovered what venture capital was. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is someone's job. I want to do that. That seems incredible. And so from that point forward, sort of viewed my resume as if it was my portfolio. Started to work at companies that I thought would look good on my resume by the time I graduated. And if I couldn't invest my money into those companies, maybe I could invest my time. And I think time's way more valuable than money anyway. So went and interned at SpaceX and Nest and General Assembly and a bunch of other companies. And by the time I was getting ready to graduate, I just started reaching out to every venture firm I could think of. And almost all of them were good luck. We're never going to hire a kid out of college. And so got super lucky. I got paired up, or I got introduced to Ludlow through Ryan Hoover at Product Hunt, who Ludlow was an investor in. And thankfully they were willing to take a chance on me as an intern. And then from there, parlayed that into joining them full time. So we're a small team of 3. We're on our third fund, and really investing at the earliest stages. So pre-seed and seed is really where we're investing. I spend a lot of time thinking about the future of media and consumer and creators, all of that stuff, gaming. But really, I try and be a generalist. I hang out on all different edges of the internet and try and bounce around into a lot of different places. But that's the super high level.
I love it. Great story. I think the power of kind of taking your career and ambitions into your own hands. What specifically, if we go back to that boardroom when you first discovered what venture capital was, I remember the moment I first discovered like the whole, not necessarily particularly venture capital, but the idea of startups. I was actually listening to Alex Bloomberg's startup podcast that kind of got me super interested when I was young. And then I was lucky to have him on the pod later on. And kind of that moment was just like, oh my God, this is all I want to do. And I was obsessed. And so in your case, I'm guessing there was something similar there in regards to venture capital. What specifically intrigued you in regards to the idea of being in VenCap?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just sort of like the range of people in the room, but also just like the range of like how many companies these investors were spending time with. Like, like they were spending time with Zarly on the board, but they were also on the board of a whole bunch of other companies. Mm-hmm. And I was like, whoa, like I don't have to just like work at one company for the rest of my life in terms of like, this is the only thing I'm going to focus on. There's a role in this like universe that sort of feeds into like just my natural curiosity and ADD and all that stuff where like I can just spend time in a lot of different places and be helpful from like a very high level strategic level. But like for me, it's the opportunity to work with really amazing and talented like founders. Like that is a really, really cool experience. And especially when you can actually become like true friends with those people and become like a real sounding board and like figure out any and all ways to add value. So for me, it was just like more of like the range that these venture capitalists were focusing on. It was just like, oh my gosh, you cover so many different areas that like really covers like me as a human if I just want to spend time in so many different places.
Mm-hmm. Now you were making investments at Ludlow on their team pre-COVID. And yes. You're still there, so it's safe to assume you're making investments, or you're at least on their team post-COVID. Yep. How has the venture landscape changed, adapted, evolved? I have to imagine there's been some shifts.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's a bit unique because we are based in Detroit, and almost all of our investments are on the coast, anyways. We traveled a decent amount before COVID, but like I would say a very large percentage of the investments we were making was actually over Zoom to begin with. So like we were like uniquely adapted to this already. Like really the only difference from an operational side for us is just that the three of us aren't in an office like together. And so maybe there isn't that serendipity of us just all sitting and talking about random things constantly. But like we definitely adjusted on that front very quickly because again, we'd been making investments over Zoom for, I don't know, the past 7 years as a fund or 8 years as a fund. And so from that side, not too much has changed. I think venture, there was a period in time in like March and April where things really started to slow down and everyone started taking a moment of like, how are things going to change? How's the world going to change? All of that. But it's definitely rebounded quickly. And there's certain areas, obviously, that have really been hurt. Like, I mean, retail and those things, and anything that is very clearly affected by COVID is being hurt as an industry. But there's also tons of industries that are starting to like emerge. And so there's very clearly certain areas that are heating up what's in the venture space as well, like virtual events and content creator stuff, like all of that is definitely having a moment within the venture space as well. And so trying to navigate it is super difficult and interesting of like, how long are we going to be in this? Is this the new normal? All of those questions are things that I think every single investor is trying to navigate and guide through.
Mm-hmm. Now, pre-COVID, there were really interesting arguments or ideas in regards to being in a big startup hub like San Francisco, or I guess you could say New York, or Austin was definitely on the rise, and then London and overseas. And then there are also firms who decided, and it seems like Ludlow was more in this boat, that like, you know what, we can make investments in those regions, but we don't actually have to be there. And I know a lot of firms in Canada have had this view. Toronto's a decent startup hub, or like I guess was in 2019. Big question mark now with COVID. But, like there are firms that are decided like, we're not going to be in Toronto. We're going to kind of be in like a secondary Canadian city and where it's cheaper, etc. Now, what was the thinking for that argument in regards to Ludlow? I know you're not a co-founder of Ludlow, but you've been on the team for a while. You started there as an intern, which we kind of brushed over. But talk about the thesis in regards to being in Detroit specifically. And do you think overall, has that been an advantage or has it slowed you down in certain places?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like just the super high level of why we are here is really just because like that's where we were born and raised, and it's where our families are. And so when Jonathan started the funds, I don't know, 9 years ago or something like that, it was very much like, let's see if we can make this work from here. And I think there was a ton of like, who knows if this will work, but we had confidence that we could do it. I think as a fund, we just view it in the same way a New York or I don't know, San Francisco based firm might invest on the opposite side of the coast. We feel very similar to that. And I think for us, there's tons of advantages, like way more than people think, like mainly in the fact that we are able to just like put our heads down and focus. Like every time I'm in a major city, whether it's for traveling or work or whatever it might be, I just feel always like distracted. And I think for me, like being able to write and have clarity of thought and independent conviction is just so huge within this industry. And that's what I'm always focusing on, is just like, let me just put my head down and work and read and hang out on the internet, rather than like go and try to go to some networking event or anything like that. And obviously there's pros and cons to all of it. Like there's for sure tons of serendipity that happens when you're within those areas. And I think for us, we're just very aware that we need to focus and figure out how to make up for that.
And so one of the interesting things is that I've kind of, I guess, learned from doing interviews specifically during this pandemic is kind of the realization that a lot of amazing companies, startups, were built during hard times in recessions. Yep. I mean, most notably 2008, that kind of spawned like a whole wave of startups, Airbnb, etc. And, right now it's kind of unclear what the market and economy is going to do. I know people who say like there's 100% going to be a major recession that would make March look like, child's play. And I know some people who are like, yeah, you know what, this is a little over exaggerated. There will be a vaccine and our problems will be solved. And it's really, really difficult to make a prediction. And so that's a conversation of its own. But it's safe to say 2020 has presented new opportunities in the world of startups that quite frankly didn't exist in 2019. It's an accelerant, but what industries and what opportunities specifically excite you at Ludlow? And kind of what are you really interested in these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is like that answer changes daily. But like for me, I spend a lot of time, and I was spending time in this before COVID as well. But I think COVID has been an accelerant of the space, and so really just interested in like anything that helps enable like entrepreneurship in any way, like make it easier to run a business. And that could be vertical SaaS, that could be APIs and developer tools, or that could be like a consumer platform for content creators, or it could be like helping a content creator run their business easier. Like all of that is just a general theme that I'm spending time in, mainly out of, I think a lot of the value is accruing to the individual. And so I think when you give more tools to the individuals to either start their own business or run their business more efficiently, it gets really interesting really quickly.
I mean, one of the best examples of that is Shopify.
Yeah, for sure.
Just enabling entrepreneurs to kind of making it more accessible, especially, in e-commerce. Coming up, I continue my conversation with Ludlow venture partner Blake Robbins. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor. Welcome back to The Ones Who Succeed. I'm Campbell Barron, and we're going to jump right back into my conversation with Blake Robbins. What about this shift? You mentioned pre-COVID, the team at Ludlow would kind of congregate in Detroit together. And honestly, I think the people that I talk to that really enjoy work from home, have a nice house, married, for most people, especially people starting out their career, it's not as, the WeWork office is a little bit nicer. There's no kombucha on tap. It's a little bit more difficult. and also, quite frankly, like the change of pace is nice. I personally like being able to get out of bed and like leave. And I think I'm not alone in that. Do you think this work from home shift, do you think it's going to be a major shift post-COVID? Let's say, in this time next year, COVID's whatever, it's eradicated, vaccine, I don't know what's going to happen, but let's say it's not a threat anymore. Do you think 50% of the workforce decides, we're going to stay home, I like this? Or do you think we kind of all just resume our normal ways?
I think as long as like kids are able to go back to school and those things, then I think a lot of people will prefer to stay at home. I think it's really like, especially when you think outside of our bubble of like tech and software, like I think most people really don't love their jobs to begin with. And so like being able to achieve that from home is like way more preferred for these people. Like a lot of these people would much rather work from home than be in the office. My guess is that it likely ends up in some sort of compromise where you have it and they come in maybe once a week, and maybe it's like on Wednesdays and Fridays that your team comes in. But it's really unclear. And I think it's really going to depend on the leadership of these companies to decide how they want to steer it moving forward. But I think there's tons of pros and cons to it. And like for me, I definitely feel like I'm working actually way more than I normally do, because there's actually like no balance between work and life at this point. But there's probably a ton of people in the counter of that where like they're probably super unproductive and they're probably finding some way to not do their work right now because they're just working from home and probably watching TV or something right now.
I do ask, is that a flex though? Because I think being able to have a little bit of a work-life balance, or for me, it's just the idea of space, like having two separate locations. This is where I sleep and eat, and this is where I am productive. When we reopen, are you planning on going back to the office? Is Ludlow even going to have an office?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. My guess is that we will be together in some way for sure. The question is whether that's at each other's houses or at an office. That part's unclear. But I think we definitely love to be together and spend time with each other. And I think there's no denying like the serendipity that happens from us being in the same room with each other. So that's for sure. I don't know what it will look like, and like actually whether it's in an office or at each other's home. Like we're a small team of 3, so we have a little bit more flexibility. But yeah, I think having the balance is really important, and I think a lot of people are losing the balance by being at home right now, and in both ways. Some people are working way more, and some people are working way less.
Now, like mentioned previously, recessions or hard times, quote unquote hard times, they can often present new opportunities. And so work from home seems like an obvious pillar. And I really just want to touch on that to see kind of what your thoughts are. But there's also like this idea that kind of apps on people's phones, and this isn't my idea. This is an investor named Nicole Quinn at Lightspeed. She shared this, and I thought that it was really smart. And I guess this was in April, so this was what you could say like peak pandemic or so far, where everyone was like really hunkered down. And like there are these core apps, Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, that you might not be moving or using anymore, and so you might be sliding those away kind of onto your like second page of your home screen. And does that present a new opportunity for a new wave of social apps or consumer apps to kind of fill that first wave? And I thought that was a very interesting framing. And it seems like one of the apps that I've been super intrigued by was Clubhouse, and that kind of took off in April. And yesterday, I am happy to say that I am officially on the beta, and I've had a little addiction going on. And it's really cool. It's really, really cool. And I actually, honestly, like the way I'm integrating into my workflow is like, instead of listening to a podcast, if I work, I will listen to Clubhouse. And I think that's a little bit of a scary shift because I'm a big podcast fan. But I think once the hype dies off and I'm figure out a way to kind of like balance the two, I think it will work itself out. But what are your thoughts on Clubhouse specifically? And then I have a bunch of questions just about the consumer space, because there are a lot of smart people who are like, you know what, the big unicorn consumer tech apps have already been built. And like it's AI, it's drones, it's voice, but not the App Store. What are your thoughts? Yeah,
I mean, I think Clubhouse is fascinating. I mean, I've been playing around with it for a bit now at this point, and I think there's like a couple different ways that the product evolves, right? Like there's the serendipity of, I don't know, me hopping on and seeing that you're 100%. On and joining that. And then there's the flip side of like, maybe I just say that I'm going live at 7 p.m. tonight. And then it's like, okay, cool. I'm going to join that event. Yeah. And it's basically an event. And so for me, I'm actually more excited about like the serendipitous version of that, where it's like, I just see that you're online and I want to join. But I and like the smaller groups of just all talking rather than the one to many or two to many conversations. But it is perfect for, putting it in the background and listening. I think for me, like I love putting it on when I'm just cranking through emails and just like learning random new things. And there's definitely no shortage of interesting people on there. So I mean, it's been a great experience so far.
There are two triggers that I think are really interesting in regards to the Clubhouse ecosystem. And the first one is if I download a podcast with, let's say, like if I download a podcast and it's Ben and Felicia Horowitz, right, talking,
Yep.
and I can listen to that podcast in an hour, in 2 hours, tomorrow. There's no like ticking time bomb. But if I see on the app that Felicia Horowitz is hosting a dinner party with all these cool people that I honestly might never find or search for, it's like, oh God, I could listen to the podcast that I have downloaded that I could listen to tomorrow. Or it's like, I need to be here. And so it's really, there's kind of that time sensitivity to it that I think is interesting. And like you said, the serendipity aspect, I like being able to kind of learn about new topics that I might not necessarily expose myself to. And with podcasts, I find everyone says discoverability. It's really hard. It's like a big debate. Some people are like, discoverability isn't broken, and there are other people who think it is. I'm probably somewhere in the middle. But I think just the biggest problem I see is that I find it very difficult to discover new podcasts that aren't kind of around in my interests. You know, I'm on startup Twitter, VC Twitter, whatever. I know what the new podcasts are in regards to this space through people's tweets and et cetera. But I don't really know what the new health podcast is or what the new sports podcast is. And so I like that serendipity on Clubhouse where I can kind of immerse myself in like COVID and how it's affecting, you know, young people and whatnot. And so that's what I'm interested in. Do you see Clubhouse working as it scales? And as it's, because right now there's quite a bit of hype around it, and there definitely was, and it's a very tight knit community. But once it gets open to everyone, how do you see the platform dealing with that? And do you see it as a viable kind of consumer app?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting product decisions that they have to make moving forward, like whether they do lean into that serendipitous thing, or do they lean into the FOMO of, you know, Felicia Horowitz is hosting a dinner.
FOMO, yeah.
And so like that is a really difficult question for them to answer. And I think like they need to lean into one of those more heavily. And it seems like they're leaning more towards the bigger conversations and events. And obviously there's still going to be the random conversations that happen on the side. But I think that will be really interesting to watch how it plays out. Like, I think that there's a world where it can become really interesting. I think like it at its worst, I think it ends up like Periscope level, where people end up, you know, using it every now and then, and maybe you'll see some big events that happen through there. Question is like, does it become a daily driver or something that people are opening all the time? And I would say like my usage has slowed down over time, mainly off of like notification fatigue, and the FOMO sort of like wears off after you like miss a couple, where you're like, all right, whatever, like I've missed this already. But like in the early days, I mean, I was opening the app multiple times a day for several hours. I think the truth is like once they get you to open the app though, like you're probably staying, or if not longer, like especially if you're speaking, you're probably staying for like an hour, which is really, really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think Paul Davidson did a really good job. He does the Clubhouse team, Paul and Rohan, they do a good job kind of engaging the community in the development of the app. And they do these town halls, and I had my first town hall yesterday. And honestly, like, it's really, really interesting to kind of see how he engages, how they both engage with the community, and like, people go on stage and they share their ideas. And the other big surrounding question around the whole Clubhouse story in my mind is, can a consumer app make it in 2020?
Yep.
Can they? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I'm actually like not in the camp that like consumers dead or social learning. Like the bigger theme that I'm more interested in is like, and I've probably tweeted this at this point, but like I really do believe like the next big consumer apps will be built around like influencers and people with huge communities and audiences already. Like I think if you have the distribution, like if you're Mr. Beast or David Dobrik, like you have a ton of distribution. As long as you build something that makes sense for your community, then I think there's some really, really big potential around that. And that's where I think like consumer is broken in the sense that like acquiring users is really, really expensive. And that's like the main pushback of why people will say that. But if you're a creator who has a huge audience already, you actually just remove all customer acquisition costs. Like your opportunity cost as a creator is actually just that you aren't doing a brand deal on that video or something. And instead you're promoting your own thing, which is far better off for them anyways.
All right. Okay. So this is a huge topic discussion I really want to get into here. So I want to dive in here. So this is what I know you for on Twitter. And I think you have the most interesting perspectives on kind of you're really, really in tune with the creator side of startups, entrepreneurship. And so I have many questions on this, but I want to pose this idea. So one of the first examples of this I saw was Beam and Casey Zapp. And so I had Matt Hackett, who is the co-founder of Beam, on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. He's really, really, really cool. And so we were the core question there was, I think this is a little bit different, right? Because Beam was started with Matt and Casey before Casey really built his brand, but Casey built his brand as a result of Beam to kind of promote it. And so right off the gate, in like a week, I think Matt told me that they went from 0 to 1 million users. And that is crazy. But that is also what is expected. And a lot of the discussion with Matt was the scary side of growth. And like growth is it's kind of praised in Silicon Valley, but it can be dangerous if you don't deliver a sufficient product. And that was the problem with Beam, was this is Matt's word, but the advertising was a lot better than the actual product itself, and people downloaded it to do A, and they couldn't, and so they kind of just moved it off to the side and then deleted it. And so I guess my first question here, and then I want to get to I want to unpack this. And my first question to unpack this is, do you think being an entrepreneur and being a creator, while they're both theoretically businesses, they are very different skill sets, I think, personally. Yep. And so do you think creators themselves, all creators themselves, or these creators that you're talking about, I'm sure some are more entrepreneurial than others, do you think these creators are cut out, or is it in their best interest to kind of build a app or a product or something that is more than merch?
Yeah, I think most creators just don't even realize they're running businesses. And so that's the first problem, right? I think most creators are in love with the fact that they have fans and they're making money from YouTube and things like that. But they don't realize that they already are running. I mean, some are small businesses, some are big businesses, right? Depends on the creator. At some point, I think creators have to make a shift or flip a switch of how am I going to actually treat this as a business? And not all of them need to do that. But I think there's going to be a good chunk, at least at the very high tier. And then there's going to be a ton of long tail as well, where maybe you only have 10,000 fans, but you're trying to figure out how to monetize that well, or maybe you have 1,000. I don't know. There's all of that around. You're just trying to focus on your really hardcore audience. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a good amount of creators that are trying to be entrepreneurial. And most of them actually just follow the lead of other creators. And so merch is the most clear example of that. Every single creator at this point has merch, but someone is going to pave the way in other ways. And we see Logan Paul rolling out his subscription products, and Nelk Boys have rolled out their subscription products. That will be an interesting space to watch as more creators. Do they also follow that? And then you have some creators like Emma Chamberlain, who's made her coffee company, and that's super on brand for her. But I think to go back to even just Matt's point, I think it's, as a creator, you need to figure out what product is being built that makes a ton of sense for you as a creator, and as your brand, and something that will resonate with your audience and community. The Emma Chamberlain coffee thing makes a ton of sense, or Mr. Beast and Finger on the App makes a ton of sense. Figuring out those opportunities, I think, is really key. There's likely going to be some sort of platform or agency or something like that exists to help build this for these creators. There might be an agency that just exists, a dev shop that's hey, let us just build your stuff for you. You're seeing it on the games side a little bit for creators. But I think there's probably going to be, in my view of the world, I think there's going to be a Fair or Shopify for creators, where the creators themselves are hey, I'm a surfer YouTuber. My audience is this. These are my favorite colors. Can you just make me a white labeled surfboard that I can sell to my audience? Mm-hmm. And this company will be sure, we'll just drop ship it for you right now. Here's the name, put Blake's surfboard on there, and there you go. And I think that's how this evolves. Merch is the first step, but I think direct to consumer 3.0 probably looks closer to this white label of everything.
Coming up on the program, I continue my conversation with Blake Robbins at Ludlow Ventures. The Ones Who Succeed will be right back after a brief word from our sponsor. Welcome back to the Ones Who Succeed in my conversation with Blake Robbins. He's at Ludlow Ventures, and we're going to jump right back into that conversation. Yeah, so it seems like merch is now one of the core revenue streams, and it's completed mass adoption. I think the switch is, so here's the idea, right? Let's say David Dobrik decides to add a social element to the Disposables app. The key question in regards to, and going back to Clubhouse, right now, I think the goal with Clubhouse is when it launches, my guess is how can we move beyond Silicon Valley and Paul Davidson's network and Paul Davidson's network, and how can we have mass adoption, right? And I think the same question would be asked with Beam, which is how can we move beyond people just wanting to watch more bits of Casey, and how can we move beyond more bits of people kind of wanting to watch, David Dobrik on his disposable app. So how do you see an app like that scaling that's so heavily tied to one's brand and one's prominence? And as we know, YouTubers and creators become irrelevant. It is a difficult industry to stay in the spotlight, and it doesn't always work out for a long period of time. There are probably 3 creators I could think of who are still peaking. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think it's trying to build something bigger than yourself. If Beam, the product, was maybe better, who knows? That. I think that's the. I
think the timing was off. Honestly, I think it'd be a little bit of a different story today. To be honest.
It's hard to say for Beam because it ultimately comes down to the product, right? Is your product good enough to retain the users themselves? The distribution is only so good, in the sense that you can get a ton of eyeballs and you can get a ton of people to download it, but if the product is not great, then people aren't going to stay. And so there's that side of it is really critical. And like we were saying before, most creators aren't builders in the sense of that, and so they need to find people who can build products that really fit their brand or what the expectations of their audience is. And I think what Mr. Beast has done with Finger on the App is a really good example of what can happen when you have a good developer team mixed with a really big creator, and just you have so many people installing that and recording it and all of that from and that's a new consumer app, and we'll see where it goes from here. And if they relaunch it or if they launch it in multiple versions of it, who knows where they take it from here. But when you build a good product mixed with really great distribution, you have, it's super unfair advantage and you have a real moat.
Yeah, 100%. Look, you see this with D2C brands by celebrities, House Labs, Lady Gaga's, Lightspeed was a big investor. And yep. Nicole's look, it really doesn't hurt when you have, 100 million people who idolize you to kind of get a head start there. But I think the differences here with House Labs is it's a physical product, right? And so, and an app can kind of, an influencer can honestly gain prominence and lose prominence overnight. It seems, especially consumer apps, it seems like it's a very fickle industry. So how do you draw the line between a creator and a creator who is making David Dobrik making money, a lot of money? That doesn't necessarily mean he's a startup in my mind, right? Because it's still David Dobrik LLC. So how do you draw the line between a creator and a startup? Are creators startups?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a case that creators have outsized returns. If you could invest in David Dobrik and I don't know, 5 years ago, that would have been an amazing bet. If you could have taken equity in David Dobrik LLC. But I think where the lines start to get blurry is the products that they need to be building. There's sort of 2 separate categories, right? One is very clear to their own brand, and this is I'm just going to build I don't know, House Labs type things and throw my name on it and have it be tied to me. And then there's the other side of this is for my audience, and my audience will definitely love it, but this is a bigger brand that has nothing tied to me as an individual. I will be the person promoting it. I will be, I don't know, CEO or COO or whatever the name is, title for it. But right. You're not necessarily saying that this is who you are and you're super married to it long term. It's much more of you're building this in hopes that more people use it. Even Mr. Beast Finger on the App, I imagine if they relaunch it, they've probably now transcended the fact that it's Mr. Beast, right? Like there's probably people that will install that app purely off of like, they just want to win money. And they're like, oh, who's Mr. Beast? Like that is the holy grail.
And that's so powerful.
Yes.
You use his audience as a springboard, but
yes.
it kind of creates a life of its own. And what about, and so like you said, Lady Gaga's House Labs, pretty clear example, but a very different example than Lady Gaga merch, right? Yep. Because, and it sounds like a tiny differentiator for anyone like not really super in tune, but it's actually a huge differentiator because it's not tied to your solo prominence. It's promoted by your prominence. And so last year I got connected with Zach from Yes Theory, and then I had Yes Theory on the podcast.
Oh, amazing.
And
they're great.
And so I've been started in Montreal, and I've been a big fan of their work for a while. But one of the things that I asked them, and I'm not going to tell you their answer until I hear your answer, which was the idea of like, is Yes Theory a startup? Because I was really like trying to poke at this, because I'm personally a little bit torn, and I think basically the idea that I'm really curious about is like, you have Yes Theory, which is like a group themselves, but I think if Instagram's prominence was tied to Kevin Systrom and something, God forbid, happened to Kevin Systrom, Instagram would not be a great investment, because then people would stop using it, and it might get a lot of prominence at some point, and then it would kind of die off, right? And I think you can say that a similar thing with YouTube kind of brand / merch. Like, let's take Seek Discomfort, for example. Is Seek Discomfort Yes Theory merch, or is it intentionally something else, something like a brand just pushed by Yes Theory? And in fact, they have a CEO now. So it seems like it's a separate entity that's continuing to be pushed by Yes Theory. But the real question is it still tied to Yes Theory's prominence, which in 10 years, are they going to be a thing? It's completely unclear. Who knows? How do you differentiate the startup from the brand? And do you think, like, I saw you tweeted like something about to the effects of, if you're going to build the next Patagonia, it helps having like a large following, etc. And you kind of pointed to Seek Discomfort. What are your thoughts? Do you see Seek Discomfort is that something that could be venture scale in the future?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think if you look at Barstool, right? Like Barstool is probably one of the best examples of this. Barstool is very heavily tied to Dave Portnoy, and the truth is, you use your audience and you build your audience. That's like the first phase, right? Like, going back to Yes Theory. Yes Theory is still in phase 1, and where they've built a massive audience. They're building a media company around that. The question is like, they are a startup, because I really do think if you were to build Patagonia today, or if Phil Knight was going to build Nike again today, it probably would look similar to a strategy that Yes Theory is taking to build their brand today. Like, the storytelling is tier 1, and people are really resonating with it. The question is like, how do you take it to the next step? What products do you build around that? Like, I mean, Red Bull in a lot of ways benefited from, the storytelling and being a part of like really great extreme athletes really early on. And so I think like Yes Theory specifically, I think they are a startup. Like,
so you think Yes Theory is a startup?
I think they are all aligned in that like they want to build something bigger than themselves. And like, that would be my definition of a startup here, is that they want Yes Theory and Seek Discomfort to be a brand bigger than themselves, rather than like, this is just me and Amar and Matt and Thomas as like individuals. And right. I like the fact that they've been very intentional about that from the beginning, like tells me that they've always thought about it as a bigger vision. But I think it's a really tough question for them. Like, I think that answer becomes way more clear when you have like an actual vision of what are the products and things that you're going to build as a thing. But again, like, they have huge distribution, and I'm confident they will figure out a way to build really great things around them. Like, for example, they should be building a travel site. Like, if you were to build like TripAdvisors today, like, would it look like Yes Theory, or would it look like how TripAdvisor looks today? I don't know. My guess is that it probably would look closer to Yes Theory, where like you're telling these amazing stories of traveling around the world and doing really amazing and unique experiences. Like, they have really great stories around that, and have clearly cultivated an audience around it.
Mm-hmm. If you compare Yes Theory though to like right now, let's say it's a media company. Do you think, and this is not a Yes Theory specific question, but do you think a brand like Yes Theory is too heavily tied to Matt Thomas and Amar? Because if you look at Vice, right? Vice had their HBO show, and Shane Smith was definitely like, seemed to be the face of Vice for a while, but it seems like he's kind of taken a step back and it's its own thing. How do you balance those two?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very real concern of like, are you too dependent on the talent itself? But I think like the best media companies and best companies in the future will navigate that. Like Barstool is still to this day dependent on Dave Portnoy in some ways, but there are definitely a lot of people underneath the Barstool brand that a lot of people resonate with, and hopefully are discovering Barstool through them rather than Dave himself. And so like I think that over time, and we've seen Yes Theory, like they rolled out like a cooking show with Matt's brother recently on a side channel. Like they're experimenting, and I think they also understand that like being tied to all of them individually is really, I mean, it's a very big strength. And so like they should continue to lean into that for as long as they can, and hopefully help bring up other stars with them.
All right. And a few more questions here. I'm really, really enjoying this discussion. This is I've been having a lot of these questions for a really long time, and I think you're one of the best people to talk to. But how do you see, you talk a lot about the future. You mentioned if Phil Knight's building a company today, it wouldn't hurt that Phil Knight had 3 million Instagram followers. If someone's building a travel site today, they might want to be Yes Theory, etc. Do you truly think that the majority of companies being built, startups being built, investable startups that Ludlow will fund, will be creator driven, or do you still see a massive market for kind of, me or you or someone in between kind of deciding here's the problem, here's the solution, here's my programming experience, like let's get this going?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for sure the latter still. Like I think there's the truth is the opportunities to build here are really around like actually just giving these creators tools, right? There's going to be amazing startups that are emerged for these creators to run businesses. Like in the same way Shopify, is just powering the back end of all of this. Like there's going to be people that build really interesting tools, and it goes back to like again before where I was talking about like anything that helps enable entrepreneurship, I'm just really interested in. And so like being the platform and infrastructure layer itself is just such an interesting spot to play in. And that's where like I'm very, very interested in. So like I there will definitely like, again, who knows if Yes Theory is venture scale or quote unquote, or if so-and-so YouTuber is venture scale as far as their businesses go. But what I do know is like the tools that they will be using to help run their business will ultimately become big businesses as well, because it hopefully becomes the norm for everyone else who wants to create these businesses. In the same way, Yes Theory probably uses Shopify right now. Like that's like figuring out what tools they're using is a really good place to start.
Yeah. Really well said. And as a last note on this kind of creator subject here, I think the best example you gave was Portnoy and Barstool, because that is really true. That is a company that is heavily reliant on the prominence of Dave, and is also simultaneously quite venture scale, I would say. And I think you and I are in agreement on that. And I mean, I don't think did they go down that route ever? I don't think so.
They went with there's a firm called the Chernin Group back in the day, about 5 years ago, that invested in them. They actually took a majority stake about 5 years ago.
Oh, really?
And basically helped put in a business team, a management team, like they hired Eric Nardini and a lot of the early business employees and built out that infrastructure. And a lot of it, like from my understanding, was like, Dave, you're incredibly talented. You have a huge audience, and Big Cat, you're all very, very talented. You continue to do editorial. You can continue to build audience. We will build products and sell against this inventory. And I mean, they've executed incredibly well. And I mean, now Barstool, who knows? Like, like they could do anything. Like, obviously, they got acquired by Penn National recently for some stake. I forget the amount, but before that, they could have for sure moved into gambling on their own. Like they have a very clear read on who their audience is, and they can move into their own alcohol brand. They can move into gambling. Like there's a lot that they can do within that space. And so I think it helps that they have Dave, but it also helps that their audience is really, really engaged and very clear. It's like the type of person those people hopefully are, or their interests. Like they all love sports, they probably love gambling, they probably like drinking. Like those things are very clear with their brand, and as a result, like they can very clearly sell against that.
It seems like you have a pretty good read in regards to the Barstool audience and their interests. And I also think that the Dave Portnoy management kind of event kind of speaks to the larger narrative, which you seem to be pushing, which was like, is David Dobrik going to be the guy who is calling the shots and managing the team? Not likely. He has other important things to do. Is David Dobrik going to have a co-founder or an agency or someone who's kind of doing that? Maybe. and then that's kind of how this works, because they're
and David, probably his best use of his time probably isn't sitting in a meeting talking about like payroll and things like that. Like he should be hiring the right people around him to navigate that for him. So
right.
I think that's like where I think this is heading. And David, by the way, should know his audience better than anyone else. And so he still should be involved in those product discussions and vision and things like that. But very high level strategy, you shouldn't have to deal with the nitty gritty of like UX decisions or anything like that.
Yeah, very interesting. And to kind of wrap up this conversation, this is probably the question that I've been curious about. You tweet like an entrepreneur, Blake. You absolutely do. It honestly seems like almost every 2 days there's a new business idea or a new concept or a new something. You'll frame it as like, I'm really interested in this, but we all know that it's like, no, you had that idea, man. Like you're interested in that. And so I'm really curious. You're a VC now. You've spent time at startups. It seems like you've got to taste entrepreneurship, but also taste kind of the world of Silicon Valley and tech and building things. Do you ever see a world where you kind of go off on your own and start something?
Honestly, I think like no right now. Like I love venture capital. Like I think there might be a world where, I don't know, I stumble upon something that I truly love and I'm obsessed with. But I think what's more likely is like, and we've done a little bit of this at Ludlow, is like incubating these ideas, and I love to be involved at the idea stage and getting things off the ground. But that's like way more interesting to me than running a business past like 20 employees. That just like, that doesn't like, I do have ADD, like in the sense of like, I love jumping, like, and even in the way you asked that question of like every 2 days, I'm like saying a new area that I'm interested in, like that is very much me as a human. And that like, there are a lot of random areas of the internet that I'm hanging out in that interest me. And so it's to find something that I would really want to jump in on full time for, like whatever I would build, I would hopefully be building for the next decade or two. And so in order for me to have enough conviction to do that, that would have to be a really crazy level of conviction. So yeah, I'm never going to say never, but I love my job and love what I'm doing. And like getting to work with amazing entrepreneurs is by far the best thing like for me as a human. So I don't know if I will ever go and like make the jump myself.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick follow up on that. If you were going to start something, or let's say you were advising someone, I guess you probably shouldn't. So if you're advising someone to start a company in a specific industry, that's a bunch of red flags there. But let's say, I guess what I'm trying to say is, what if you were going to start something, what are the industries that you are really interested in that just get you excited in general?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different areas, but I think one is like creator monetization and just like from a very high level, I think that creators are relying way too heavily on the platforms themselves that they're on. Like they're sort of like, okay, I make a ton of money off of YouTube AdSense and brand deals, and I'm just going to continue to post on YouTube and like never really think about diversification at all. And that's like why I've mentioned like they are running businesses, they just don't realize it. And so like they won't realize it until something gets cut off, like maybe they get demonetized or their AdSense gets cut or something like that. And they're like, oh, wow, like I just built my entire business on this other platform and I have no leverage over my audience or anything like that. And so for me, that is an area in specific that I'm spending a lot of time in around like direct to your fans, like monetization. So like Cameo is one example, but what if you like offer your membership products or things like that, where I'm really obsessed with this idea of like gated content and where that's heading. Like I'm big believer that like David Dobrik is leaving a ton of money on the table by not putting vlogs behind paywalls moving forward. Like if and when he comes back, assuming he comes back and starts posting YouTube videos, like if he explained to his audience, hey, I'm not making any money from YouTube because they've demonetized my channel, which they have, then like he can explain the narrative.
Is that true?
Like, yes.
Yeah, interesting. I see.
He's not able to run any pre-roll ads or mid-roll ads on his videos. And so he makes his money from brand deals like SeatGeek, which is amazing, but like he's still leaving a lot of money on the table in terms of overall audience or like overall money that he could be making from these videos. And so like I think there's a world where he can do one video on the platform, one video off a week, and I think it would monetize incredibly well. So that's one area that I'm spending a lot of time in.
Cool. A few more questions here before we wrap up. Like any VC, and maybe not like any VC, but I just have to ask this because you're in the world of venture. Have you missed any Googles?
Not yet, but I'm sure I have. Like, I'm sure that I have passed on great companies. It's like
it just takes a while to find out.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm in my 5th year into this role and world, and so like haven't found any yet that I've like really missed or had like a very clear opportunity to invest in. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure they will pop up. I mean, that's part of the game.
Yeah. How do you know seems like you really love everything about venture, which is really exciting. It's exciting when you find something you really enjoy. How do you know you're a VC versus an entrepreneur? What are the key kind of realizations in terms of the type of person you are from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that answer is so difficult to answer because I think it varies so greatly depending on the person. You know, like I think there's so many different ways that you can approach venture. Like, I mean, you talk to 20 different VCs, they probably all have different strategies and views on what makes venture special or what excites them about it. For me, like I am really genuinely curious, and like I'm super obsessed with like the edges of the internet. I really do love finding random like internet niches and being like, oh, wow, there's like a really hardcore community about this. I'd love to like learn more about this. And so I'm always like, that is my, like what I think like lends myself to doing, I don't know, well in this space. Who knows what well looks like. Hopefully I end up being a great investor, and that's always the goal. But like, I also try and write a lot, and like, for me, I'm obsessed with just writing and reading and just like getting clarity of thoughts. And I think one of the most difficult things about venture is like independent conviction and figuring out like whether you liked something or not on your own. And that's actually really, really hard to do. Like, I think a lot of people like will naturally lean on other people to make those decisions for them. But like to actually be like, okay, I'm going to do this deal before anyone else and invest in a company before anyone else. That's really difficult. And so figuring out how to get to independent conviction is something that I think everyone has to navigate and figure out. Well,
Blake, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the program. This is why I do the podcast, to have these awesome conversations. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. This is great.
That's Blake Robbins, one of the ones who succeed. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, it would be amazing if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out. Or why not tell a friend? That also helps new listeners discover the show. I really appreciate it. If you want to see clips from the show and stay up to date with what I'm working on, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Campbell J. Barron. And you can find this podcast on YouTube. Our channel is The Ones Who Succeed. You've made it to the end of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Campbell Barron, and I'll be back in no time.